Hello, everybody. I know it's getting late, so I'm going to try to go a little bit faster than I planned to leave time for questions. I also tried to make this probably the least technical talk of the day because I know that we're all getting tired. So my name is McClellan. I'm a field CTO for Splunk. My focus is on data management. My focus is not on getting new headshots taken, so I need to get that done at some point. But it's really nice to be here today. So we're all in the AI space. I think everybody now effectively is in the AI space, right? But the reality is that a lot of AI projects fail to meet expectations, right? I think we all probably saw the MIT article from about, 6 weeks ago, where they said that 95% of projects failed to produce an ROI. Funny story. When they did a similar report about big data in around 2012, they gave the exact same metric. So all that's telling me is that we're still kind of early in the AI adoption curve. But it does mean that there's some lessons we can learn from big data to help us kind of figure out where these projects are failing and how we can accelerate both the adoption and the value curve, right? So the reality is that most projects fail in the trenches, right? Whether it's integrating systems or prepping the data that is going into those systems, that's where things tend to kind of go haywire, right? Now, my background is in data management. I've been at 7 data platform companies. I was an ETL developer. And the reality is that if you get the data right, the rest of the work gets easier. I wouldn't say it's easy, but if the data is wrong, it's very much a garbage in, garbage out kind of a scenario. Whereas if you get the data prep right, you're much more likely to be able to hit your goals, right? So organizations that are able to leverage their data to make decisions are a lot more effective at meeting their goals, right? That's what pays all of our paychecks, right? And those organizations are 150% more likely to get a positive result from their AI adoptions, right? So what does that mean? It means that we all need to get our data to be AI ready. But let's be frank, it's not right now. Most of us have as fractured a data environment as we have an application environment. So we probably have a dozen or so different data sources in our organization, maybe even more. Plus we have a bunch of SaaS applications that each host their own copy of the data. A lot of cases, it's the same data in a slightly different format. And this can cause an enormous amount of trouble when you go to try to operationalize it, particularly when you're starting to try to apply things like machine learning and AI to those workflows. So you could probably tear this architecture diagram apart. Can you tell that I didn't have Splunk marketing help me with my slides? I promise, I did use their template, but I promise there's no commercial in here. Even a basic AI implementation, if you've got an organization where you've got more than one AI project going on, is an incredibly fragile situation, right? So you've got, hopefully everybody's picked MCP for making your data and services available to your agentic platforms. But let's just say you have 5 different sources that you want to focus on. You have a DevOps agentic platform. Maybe you have a platform that's being used by the business, and you've got kind of one other one thrown in there. And someone thought to connect them so they can talk to each other, right? That's 18 different spots where things can fail, right? And most of the cost of operating these things is at that agentic layer. And so if those agentic platforms aren't sharing a common operating model, like if they can't all see the same data, they end up having to negotiate with one another using the most expensive computing that we have in our environments, right? Whereas if we can make sure that they have access to the right data sources and they're all sharing the same context below the waterline, then things are going to be much less expensive to operate, right? And then, of course, what happens if you need to add a new data source, right? With this, you're configuring maybe a half a dozen different integrations every time you're adding a data source. It can get very complicated very quickly. So data management is the practice of figuring out where the data is coming from, how it's being secured and managed and governed. It's all the infrastructure that supports it. It's making sure it's secure, and then making sure that you're storing and leveraging the data that you're getting value out of rather than hoarding, which is what most organizations do, right? So I have the most experience in the data quality and the infrastructure and platform pillars here, but I'm going to try to do my best to talk about the other ones, okay? So when you start talking about strategy and governance, this is the stuff that if you are trying to start a new AI initiative in your organization, that you need to be aware that your bosses and bosses' bosses are talking about, right? So this is the executive alignment. This is the sponsorship. This is making sure that you have access to all the data that you need to be able to drive that outcome. And in a sophisticated organization, it's around making sure that you have a governance framework that enables access to the right types of data for the right use cases, right? Data prep, we used to call it ETL. Splunk used to call it GDI, or getting data in. But there are kind of three different ways that you can think about this. There's trying to get the data in the right format in the source system, right? That's like a projection type of a situation. There's ETL, or transformation, where while it's moving from one system to another, applying a transformation to it. Or harmonizing it. So that once it's landed in a target location, because you had to move the data, getting that to match whatever model's in that system, right? The reality is that quality eats quantity for breakfast here, right? I would rather have a thinner, slower data feed of high quality data than a fat pipe of garbage, because, you know, it's garbage in, garbage out with a lot of these situations, right? I personally always have a bias for the cleanest data possible, but as we start talking about AI, we also need to look at bias detection, data validation, the kind of automated alerting, and maybe even using AI to look at what's coming in so that you can kind of detect what's going on and notice things earlier. You need to know if that data is relevant, and you need to know where it's coming from. So one of the things, if you've ever tried to go down the rabbit hole of building an ETL pipeline, or trying to rationalize data across sources, you realize that a lot of the data is mostly the same and roughly all coming from the same places, and people forget where the data came from, right? So as it hops through systems, you'll get 3, 4, or 5 copies of the same fact or event. Or better yet, you'll have the same thing, but you'll just get reporting on it from different parts of the stack, right? You can have NetFlow data for networking. You can have application logs for an application. You can have an event. And all of those are actually describing just different parts of the same thing that just happened, right? So a lot of that data is duplicative, and you don't need it all the time, right? Infrastructure and platform, I'm a big fan of processing the data where it is as much as possible. Let's try to move and replicate as little data as possible. So how do you federate this data? How do you make sure that the right data is getting synced to the right places? How can you do this in a container native kind of a way? And most of us are in a hybrid or multi-cloud kind of an environment, right? Whether you're an organization that's still tiptoeing into the cloud or whatnot, everybody's kind of got their own different setups there, right? So beyond that, AI in particular brings a lot of interesting dimensions to security and compliance, right? We've all seen kind of these different ways of getting an LLM to drop your training data, right? we need to pay attention to this even when an AI workflow is entirely within our own walls, right? What does it look like? And how do we balance making that data available to folks in the organization, but also making sure that it's secure? And then what do we do about it when we fall down? Like, when do we fail, right? And then the last pillar, operational excellence, is about making sure we're measuring what we're trying to get out of it, right? So this can be cost and performance management. This can be driving business value. It can be reducing human toil. There are lots of kind of different things that need to happen here. So if you were getting started on an AI project, I know a lot of the folks in the room here are building tooling to help people get started with AI projects, but presumably that started because you were working in an organization that was trying to build an AI project. There are a lot of different things you need to consider, right? What's the cultural readiness in your organization to adopt AI for the challenge that you're trying to address? Something that everybody hates to do is probably a really good first use case for AI in your organization, mainly because you're not going to get a whole lot of arguments about them not having to do it anymore, right? The one bullet I want to really pull out here is how much of this process can I automate? If you can do something with traditional automation, you probably should. AI is really good at the non-deterministic stuff, but existing automation and workflow tools are just as good at automating discrete, well-known processes. So highly recommend kind of giving that lens. I've talked to some folks that are trying to AIify everything, and as much as I love that thought, there are easier ways to do some of these things, right? So when you're starting to talk about something like data preparation, this is where automation is kind of paramount, right? Once you've set up a data pipeline, it doesn't change that often unless something changes about the data source. So it's a really good spot to do traditional automation, right? But on the flip side, AI is really great for monitoring, right? Because it can tell you when something has diverged from the norm without you having to set up a bunch of rules, right? Ideally, you want to be able to do things like detect anomalies, data drift, missing data sets. All of a sudden, a sensor goes offline and stops sending you data for 15 minutes. Normally, you get a dump every 30 seconds. And we talked about this a little bit, right, with the data lineage. What am I trusting? Where is it coming from? Is it duplicative? And do the duplicates agree? One of the things that happens a lot when you're transforming data is you can accidentally translate away some of the context. So if you've ever used Google Translate to translate something from English to another language and then back into English, it gets all wonky, right? Data prep does the same thing, right? You cast something as simple as like an address field, and you try to parse it out into city and state and zip code and whatnot, and then you try to reassemble it, and you might have lost tokens, you might have lost information, all that kind of stuff. So you got to be really careful to make sure you're trusting the oldest source or the originating source whenever there's a disagreement in your data sources. So when you're talking about the infrastructure, this is different than necessarily the AI infrastructure. We are not talking about how am I going to host my AI model here. We're talking about how am I going to host the data and make it available to my models and to my workflows, right? So I'm a big believer in picking open standards. Don't pick a tech stack, right? Don't pick a technology or a vendor, pick standards, right? Standards give you the freedom to make changes when you need to. So things like OpenTelemetry and eBPF, MCP for your platforms, Iceberg for data format is great, right? You want to turn your disaster recovery into HA events, right? This is a long-standing Kubernetes talk track. Nobody has done it in the data management space successfully, right? Pretty much. So, but you can. You absolutely can. It's just harder when you have state. The other thing to keep in mind, and I imagine that at least some of the folks in the room are MLOps engineers, right? The data ops organization, whoever is feeding this data to these systems, they need to feed the MLOps teams as well, right? And what that largely means is you need to bring CI/CD to your data rather than having kind of some of the more traditional ETL pipelines. Security and compliance. There's a lot of risk around AI, right? And as you start pumping more and more enterprise data through these AI interfaces, you're going to expose more risk. There's one concept in here I'm going to call out that a lot of people that I talk to have not heard of before, which is ABAC, or attribute-based access control. It dovetails nicely with RBAC. So RBAC is where you're an entity and you have a role and you have access based on your role, right? ABAC is more of like a tag that talks about a transient state. So when you're on a trusted device and a trusted network in your employer's building or at home, they might give you access to the entirety of a data set, right? Let's say you're in the healthcare space or whatnot. ABAC might flag that, hey, they're connected through a Wi-Fi hotspot at a Starbucks. So maybe we don't give them access to download this data to their laptop right now. They have to wait and they'll get notified. If your controls don't have this attribute-based addition to your access control, you can get yourselves into a lot of trouble by people unintentionally accessing the wrong data in the wrong place and having it get exfilled, right? As much of this needs to be either automated or there's a long and probably windy talk track that we could have around how much AI do we need monitoring our own AI and all that kind of stuff. But the important thing to keep in mind is we probably don't want agents behaving exactly the same as the people whose roles they're inheriting. And we also probably want to control what data is being shown by those agents or by those models if you're interfacing with a chatbot based on where the person that's making the request happens to be, right? Like if I'm on my cell phone, I probably shouldn't be accessing enterprise data, right? Unless it is the corporate approved device. Pillar 5 is just about getting what you measure. So if you're ever in a scenario where you're trying to sell one of your leaders on being able to kick off a new project and that you're going to need access to some data sources maybe that you didn't think you needed access to or don't have access to today, the best way to get people on board is to tell them what you're going to measure and how they're going to know that they've got a return on that investment. So this does require you to think about this at the prep stage, but if you do, it pays a lot of dividends in the future. Okay, so here's a proposed implementation cycle, right? It's 3 phases. I put it out over a year. You can make this 3 months. You can make this 2 years. You can make this however long you want it to be, right? So phase 1 is getting started, right? It's assessing the landscape. What data do we have? Where is it coming from? Who owns what? Trying to take an inventory both of the systems and the data sources that you have in your environment, right? Step 1 is getting everybody aligned on the vision and making sure that you have clear goals. That way you can do pillar 5 at the end, right? Because you have to implement all of that stuff. And largely making sure that you're not going to get a bunch of human resistance, which means you don't probably want to, you don't want to pick the wrong use cases, right? Not trying to bite off too much more than you can chew. There are a lot of really great use cases for AI, and then there are a lot of less great use cases for AI today. And making sure that you have the right resources and accesses and alignment there, right? And then governance, because mistakes are going to be made and you're going to need to continuously improve. How are you going to make decisions about what you're doing, So if you don't have this in place, what will happen is you will have a security issue and some executive is going to make you shut everything down. You don't want that. I don't want that, right? So making sure you have a process to address failures when they come, and also making sure that you have a governance strategy that if you realize you're missing a data set, for example, you have the ability to onboard it quickly without getting stuck in a bunch of red tape. So phase 2 is the fun stuff. This is where you get to build things. So one, you want to look at infrastructure. I'm personally a big believer in the fewest tools approach. I am not a lover of the fact that every product on the planet right now tries to claim that it's a platform. It's going to make it harder for us to get value out of AI, largely, because they're trying to kind of hoard their little piece of the world, right? And then step 4 is pipeline development. This is setting up the data flows and making sure that it, that you're managing not just the data, but the metadata, right? So that there's a centralized place. I'm not a big believer in centralizing data, but you do need to centralize your metadata. So what that largely means is you need to describe in a catalog somewhere what data is coming from where and what you're doing to it as you're moving it. And where that is being done. Is it being done at the source? Is it being done in flight? Is it being done at the target? Then phase 3 is where people actually get to use it, right? You attach your AI tools to it. You roll it out to some pilot users that you trust, get feedback. Personally, I'm a big believer that no one should be running fully autonomous workflows on using AI right now. We probably want to be human in the loop, particularly if you're rolling out a use case for the first time. Now, that doesn't mean you might not go back and make it fully autonomous 6 or 12 months later, but to start, you definitely want to make sure that you've got a human in the loop there. And then at the end, after you've rolled it out to some users, go back and actually measure the things you said you were going to measure, right? Prove that you got the outcome you were trying to get. And if you didn't, go and iterate until you do. So we're wrapping up to the end. I do want to try to leave like 2 minutes for questions. I spoke for a little longer than I expected, but that's cool. So if any of you were around for big data, you want to look into something called the 5 V's of data. It's velocity, volume, veracity, value. I always forget one of them. I don't know why I always forget one of them, but you should be tracking these in your environment, and the metrics that you're tracking for them need to be above 90%. Some of them you want to be above 99%, right? So these are things like tracking how much data is coming, when is it coming, is it coming in as a dump or is it coming as a stream? Is the data valuable, right? Are there duplicates, all that kind of stuff, right? Second pillar is around making sure that we have the human part of the equation accounted for, right? Did you pick a use case that people actually really want to use AI for because the workflow you're replacing is really painful for people? That's good, right? Or do you have a cultural issue in your organization? Most of us probably don't have this because we're all in, tech forward organizations. But if you were working with somebody or you took a job with a company who traditionally is a late adopter of technology, you might run into challenges there. And then on that third pillar, right, we're talking about what the business impact is, right? Are we able to actually save money? A lot of cases, most of the use cases are not saving money, but they might be saving time, which can turn into saving money, right? And the thing that'll help you sell it the most in your organization is reducing human toil, even more so than kind of reducing cost. So if you only remember a couple of things from this presentation, start with value. AI projects are more about investing in people and culture than they are about investing in technology, as much as it doesn't feel like that right now. Automate anything you can. We do not have to throw AI at every single problem, but we should throw AI at the problems that otherwise don't work without AI. Plan for your platform, but implement a project that you can actually get your arms around, right? And then measure and iterate. I do a lot of writing on this, either both on my personal blog and on LinkedIn and on the Splunk blog. This is a QR code to my LinkedIn profile if you would like to follow me, and I post everything that I'm working on there. And this presentation is up on the schedule website. So those other links are where I put, when I was coding those different metrics at the beginning, those are the sources I used. Thank you very much. Any questions? I know I'm out of time, so it's probably best that nobody has any questions, but feel free to come up and ask me questions afterwards. Thank you so much.